Hi, Bryn. Ready for chapter 2? This is what Henry Sugar read in the little blue exercise book. I, John Cartwright, am a surgeon at Bombay General Hospital. On the morning of the 2nd of December, 1934, I was in the doctor's rest room having a cup of tea. There were 3 other doctors there with me, all having a well-earned tea break. They were Dr. Marshall, Dr. Phillips, and Dr. McFarlane. There was a knock on the door. "Come in," I said. The door opened, and an Indian came in who smiled at us and said, "Excuse me, please could I ask you gentlemen a favor?" The doctor's rest room was a most private place. Nobody other than a doctor was allowed to enter it, except in an emergency. "This is a private room," Dr. McFarlane said sharply. "Yes, yes," he answered. "I know that, and I am very sorry to be bursting in like this, sirs, but I have a most interesting thing to show you." All 4 of us were pretty annoyed, and we didn't say anything. "Gentlemen," he said, "I am a man who can see without using his eyes." We still didn't invite him to go on, but we didn't kick him out either. "You can cover my eyes in any way you wish," he said. "You can bandage my head with 50 bandages, and I will still be able to read you a book." He seemed perfectly serious, yet my curiosity began to stir. "Come here," I said. He came over to me. "Turn around." He turned around, and I placed my hands firmly over his eyes, holding the lids closed. "Now," I said, "one of the other doctors in the room is going to hold up some fingers. You will tell me how many he is holding up." Dr. Marshall then held up 7 fingers. "7," said the Indian. "Once more," I said. Dr. Marshall then clenched his fists and hid all his fingers. "No fingers," said the Indian. I removed my hands from his eyes. "Not bad," I said. "Hold on," Dr. Marshall said. "Let's try this." There was a doctor's white coat hanging from a peg on the door. Dr. Marshall took it down and rolled into Dr. Marshall took it down and rolled into a I think it's supposed to be it. Dr. Marshall took it down and rolled it into a sort of long scarf. He then wound it around the Indian's head and held the ends tight at the back. "Try him now," Dr. Marshall said. I took a key from my pocket. "What is this?" I asked. "A key," he answered. I put the key back and held up an empty hand. "What is this object?" I asked. "There isn't any object," the Indian said. "Your hand is empty." Dr. Marshall removed the covering from the man's eyes. "How do you do it?" he asked. "What is the trick?" "There is no trick," the Indian said. "It is a genuine thing that I have managed after years of training." "What sort of training?" I asked. "Forgive me, sir," he said, "but that is a private matter." "Then why did you come here for?" I asked. "I came to request a favor of you," he said. The Indian was a tall man of about 30, with light brown skin the color of a coconut. He had a small black moustache. Also, there was a curious matting of black hair growing all over the outsides of his ears. He wore a white cotton robe, and he had sandals on his bare feet. "You see, gentlemen," he went on, "I am at present earning my living by working in a traveling theatre, and we have just arrived here in Bombay. Tonight we give our opening performance." "Where do you have it?" I asked. "In the Royal Palace Hall," he answered. "In Acacia Street? I am the star performer. I am billed on the programme as Imrat Khan, the man who can see without his eyes, and it is my duty to advertise the show in a big way. If we do not sell tickets, we do not eat." "What does this have to do with us?" I asked. "Very interesting for you," he said. "Lots of fun. Let me explain. You see, whenever our theatre arrives in a new town, I, myself, go straight to the largest hospital, and I ask the doctors there to bandage my eyes. I ask them to do it in the most expert fashion. They must make sure my eyes are completely covered, many times over. It is important that this is done by doctors, otherwise people will think I am cheating. Then, when I am fully bandaged, I go out into the street and I do a dangerous thing." "What do you mean by that?" I asked. "What I mean is that I do something that is extremely dangerous for someone who cannot see." "What do you do?" I asked. "It is very interesting," he said, "and you will see me do it if you will be so kind as to bandage me up first. It would be a great favor to me if you do this little thing, sirs." I looked at the other three doctors. Dr. Phillips said he had to go back to his patients. Dr. McFarlane said the same. And Dr. Marshall said, "Well, why not? It might be amusing, but it won't take a moment." "I'm with you," I said. "Let's do the job properly. Make sure he absolutely cannot see a peep." "You are extremely kind," the Indian said. "Please do whatever you wish." Dr. Phillips and Dr. McFarlane left the room. "Before we bandage him," I said to Dr. Marshall, "let's first of all seal down his eyelids. When we've done that, we'll fill his eye sockets with something soft and solid and sticky." "Such as what?" Dr. Marshall has said. "What about dough?" "Dough would be perfect," Dr. Marshall said. "Right," I said. "You will nip down to the hospital bakery and get some dough, and I will take him to the surgery and seal his lids." I led the Indian out of the restroom and down the long hospital corridor to the surgery. "Lie down here," I said, indicating the high bed. He lay down. I took a small bottle from the cupboard. It had an eyedropper in the top. "This is something called collodion," I told him. "It will harden over your closed eyelids so that it is impossible for you to open them." "How will I get it off afterward?" he asked. "Alcohol will dissolve it away quite easily," I said. "It is perfectly harmless. Close your eyes now." The Indian closed his eyes. I applied collodion to both lids. "Keep them closed," I said. "Wait for it to harden." In a couple minutes the collodion had made a hard film over the eyelids, sticking them down tight. "Try to open them," I said. He tried but couldn't. Dr. Marshall then came with a basin of dough. It was the ordinary white dough used for baking bread. It was nice and soft. I took a lump of the dough and plastered it over one of the Indian's eyes. I filled the whole socket and then let the dough overlap onto the surrounding skin. Then I pressed it down hard. I did the same with the other eye. That isn't too uncomfortable, is it? I asked. No, the Indian said. It is fine. You do the bandaging, I said to Dr. Marshall. My fingers are too sticky. A pleasure, Dr. Marshall said. Watch this. He took a thick wad of cotton wool and laid it on top of the Indian's dough-filled eyes. The cotton wool stuck to the dough and stayed in place. Sit down, please, Dr. Marshall said. The Indian sat on the bed. Dr. Marshall took a roll of 3-inch bandage and proceeded to wrap it round and round the man's head. The bandage held the cotton wool and the dough firmly in place. Dr. Marshall pinned the bandage. After that, he took a second bandage and began to wrap that one not only around the man's eyes, but around his entire face and head. Please leave my nose free for breathing, the Indian said. Of course, Dr. Marshall answered. He finished the job and pinned down the end of the bandage. How's that? He asked. Splendid, I said. There's no way he can possibly see through that. The whole of the Indian's head was now swathed with thick white bandage, and the only thing you could see was the end of the nose sticking out. He looked like a man who had some terrible brain operation. How does that feel? Dr. Marshall asked him. It feels good, the Indian said. I must compliment you gentlemen on doing such a fine job. Off you go then, Dr. Marshall said, grinning at me. Show us how clever you are at seeing things now. The Indian got off the bed and walked straight to the door. He opened the door and went out. Great Scott, I said. Did you see that? He put his hand right on the doorknob. Dr. Marshall had stopped grinning. His face had suddenly gone white. I'm going after him, he said, rushing for the door. I rushed for the door as well. The Indian was walking quite normally along the hospital corridor. Dr. Marshall and I were about 5 yards behind him, and very spooky it was to watch this man with the enormous white and totally bandaged head strolling casually along the corridor, just like anyone else. It was especially spooky when you knew for certain that his eyelids were sealed, and his eye sockets were filled with dough, and that there was a great wad of cotton wool and bandages on top of that. I saw a native orderly coming along the corridor towards the Indian. He was pushing a food trolley. Suddenly the orderly caught sight of the man with a white head, and he froze. The bandaged Indian stepped casually to one side of the trolley and went on. He saw it, I cried. He must have seen that trolley. He walked right around it. That is absolutely unbelievable. Dr. Marshall didn't answer me. His cheeks were white, his whole face rigid with shock and disbelief. The Indian came to the stairs and started to go down them. He went down with no trouble at all. He didn't even put his hand on the handrail. Several people were coming up the stairs. Each of them stopped, gaped, stared, and quickly got out of the way. At the bottom of the stairs, the Indian turned right and headed for the doors that led onto the street. Dr. Marshall and I kept close behind him. The entrance to our hospital stands back a little from the street, and there is a rather grand series of steps leading down from the entrance into the small courtyard with acacia trees around it. Dr. Marshall and I came out into the blazing sunshine and stood at the top of the steps. Below us in the courtyard, we saw a crowd of many hundred people. At least a half of them were barefoot children, and as our white-headed Indian walked down the steps, they all cleared and shouted and surged towards him. He greeted them by holding both his hands above his head. Suddenly, I saw a bicycle. It was over to one side at the bottom of the steps, and a small boy was holding it. The bicycle in itself was quite ordinary, but on the back of it, fixed somehow to the rear wheel frame, was a huge placard, about 5 feet square. On the placard was written the following words: Imrat Khan, the man who sees without his eyes. Today my eyes have been bandaged by hospital doctors. Appearing tonight and all week at the Royal Palace Hall, Acacia Street at 7 p.m. Don't miss it. You will see miracles performed. Our Indian had reached the bottom of the steps, and now he walked straight over to the bicycle. He said something to the boy, and the boy smiled. The Indian mounted the bicycle. The crowd made way for him. Then, lo and behold, this fellow with the blocked-up, bandaged eyes now proceeded to ride across the courtyard and straight out into the bustling, honking traffic of the street beyond. The crowd cheered louder than ever. The barefoot children ran after him, squealing and laughing. For a minute or so we were able to keep him in sight. We saw him riding superbly down the busy street, with cars whizzing past him and a bunch of children running in his wake. Then he turned a corner and was gone. "I feel quite giddy," Dr. Marshall said. "I can't bring myself to believe it." "We have to believe it," I said. "He couldn't possibly have removed the dough from under the bandages. We never let him out of our sight. And as for unsealing his eyelids, that job would take him 5 minutes with cotton wool and alcohol." "Do you know what I think?" Dr. Marshall said. "I think we have witnessed a miracle." He turned and walked slowly back to the hospital. That's the end of chapter 2. Hope you're enjoying the story so far. See you next day. Bye, Bryn.